The ground shook first, a low, deep rumble that vibrated up through the soles of your boots. Then came the sound. The thunder of 1,000 hooves, a wall of noise that swallowed every other sound in the world. An endless storm of wild horses was tearing across the plains, aimed directly at the makeshift market on the edge of town. People screamed, merchants shouted, carts were overturned as everyone scattered for safety. But in the middle of the chaos, one person was left behind. A young woman, her face pale with terror, stumbled and fell hard onto the packed earth. The crowd shoved past her, over her, a river of panic that didn't care who it drowned. Her cry was lost in the roar of the stampede. She reached for something, anything, to hold on to. Her fingers found only a simple white kerchief tied around her neck. As she went down, she clutched it, a useless scrap of cloth against an oncoming tide of death. The crowd shrieked at her to move, but she was frozen. Some even laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. They saw her as already gone, a ghost waiting to be trampled into the dust. Time stopped. The woman closed her eyes, bracing for the impact. The white kerchief slipped from her grasp, fluttering up into the air like a tiny flag of surrender. And that's when he appeared. He burst from the edge of the chaos, a rider moving with impossible grace. His long dark hair whipped out from under a leather band. His eyes, sharp and focused, were locked only on her. It was as if the stampede didn't exist, as if the only thing in the world was the path between his horse and the fallen woman. He was a Dakota warrior, mounted on a chestnut horse that moved like lightning. In one fluid motion, he leaned low from the saddle. His arm shot down, his hand closing around her, and he lifted her from the ground without slowing. He pulled her tight against his chest as 1,000 hooves hammered the earth all around them, close enough to feel the vibration in their bones. The crowd gasped. The stampede closed in behind them, a solid wall of horseflesh, but the rider didn't falter. He drove his horse through the madness until he broke free on the other side, where the dust began to settle and the roar of the herd faded into the distance. She was trembling in his arms, struggling to breathe, to understand. She was alive. Then she saw it. In the warrior's hand he held not only her, but also the white kerchief. He had caught it from the air in the very same moment he had saved her life. He held it up for all to see. It was no longer a simple scrap of cloth. It was a testament, a symbol that even the frailest thing could survive the fury of the herd. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was a cold, hard disbelief. Because no one in that town had ever expected a so-called savage to risk his life for a stranger. The young woman was still gasping for air against the warrior's chest when his horse skidded to a stop. The animal snorted, its hooves tearing at the ground. The silence was broken by a low murmur that quickly grew into something ugly. Some people clapped, but their applause was hesitant, uncertain. Others pointed, their faces twisted with anger. "It's not right," a man shouted, "for a savage to ride into our town like he's the master of life and death." A woman selling fabric from a nearby stall shrieked, "We all saw her fall. It was her own clumsiness. Now he holds her like she's some kind of prize he's won." Another man, his hat caked in dust, yelled that the white kerchief the warrior held was a symbol of shame. No Indian, he spat, had the right to display such a thing in a civilized town. The young woman trembled, trying to pull away, but the rider held her firm. He knew the ground beneath her feet was still not safe. Children who had been hiding from the stampede peeked out from behind barrels and carts. Their eyes were wide. They didn't understand why the adults were yelling at the man who had just done the impossible. The white kerchief, held high in the Dakota's hand, rippled in the breeze. It looked like a banner, and that simple detail seemed to make the crowd even angrier. "A rag doesn't change what you are," a merchant cried. The young woman pressed her lips together. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, but from the cruelty of the people around her. They would have rather seen her trampled to death than be thankful to an Indian. Without a word, the warrior lowered her gently to the ground. He set her on her own 2 feet. Then he extended the kerchief to her, placing it back in her hands. It felt less like a gift and more like a testimony he was passing on. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a broad man in an embroidered vest stepped forward. He was the market chief, the man who ran this part of town. His voice dripped with venom. "That kerchief is already stained by his hands," the chief declared. "If you keep it, you will carry the disgrace of us all." The crowd roared. Some nodded in agreement, others fell silent, their eyes shifting nervously. The young woman looked down at the simple piece of cloth in her hands. Suddenly it felt heavier than any chain. The young woman clutched the kerchief to her chest. Her fingers, smudged with dust, trembled. The crowd's murmur grew more hostile, more threatening. "Throw it down!" a woman screamed. "Throw it to the ground before you curse this whole town!" An old man, his voice heavy with scorn, pointed a bony finger at her. "It would have been better for her to die beneath the hooves than to owe her life to a savage." The market chief stepped forward again. The embroidery on his vest glinted in the sun. He raised his hand as if he were a judge about to pass sentence. "That rag does not belong to you," he boomed, "and neither does the dignity of this town. Surrender it or be cast out." The young woman's face was streaked with tears. She turned her eyes to the Dakota warrior. She was looking for an answer, for a sign. Her life, it seemed, no longer depended on the stampede she had survived, but on the piece of cloth she now held. The warrior had been a wall of silence. But now, with the entire town watching, he spoke. His voice was deep, and it cut through the air like a razor. "That kerchief is not stained," he said. "It is alive. I carried it in my hands because she had to go on breathing." The crowd erupted. Some called his words insolent. Others whispered that maybe it was true. They had all seen it. They had all seen her about to be dragged into death. The market chief's face turned a dark red. He clenched his fists, enraged that he couldn't silence this man, a man who commanded respect even from those who hated him. "Sheriff!" the chief roared. "Someone get the sheriff! No foreigner will be allowed to dictate what is honor and what is shame in this town." The children who had watched the rescue began to whisper among themselves. They pointed at the white kerchief, now clean of dust, and their innocent voices, though quiet, planted seeds of doubt in the hearts of the adults. The young woman lifted the kerchief with both hands, holding it out for everyone to see. The breeze caught it, and it rippled, gleaming in the noon sun. A hush fell over the square. What had been a mere scrap of cloth just moments before now felt like a banner of life against hatred. But the market chief only saw defiance. He bellowed with fury and called for his men. "Seize that kerchief!" he ordered. "Seize it before the people forget who rules this square." The market men shoved their way through the crowd, their elbows flying. The young woman instinctively stepped back, clutching the kerchief. That small piece of cloth was her only shield against a town that had turned on her. The Dakota warrior moved. He stepped in front of her, his shadow falling over her like a protective wall. The air in the square grew tight, heavy with unspoken violence. The first man to lunge was a broad-shouldered youth. He reached out to tear the kerchief from her hands. But the warrior's hand was faster. It shot out, catching the man's wrist in midair. With a sharp, sudden twist, the warrior forced the man to his knees, a cry of pain escaping his lips. Another man tried to circle around from the side. Without even turning his full attention, the warrior blocked him with a crushing shove of his shoulder. The man went flying, crashing into a fruit stall. Oranges and apples scattered across the ground, a bright explosion of color in the gray dust. The crowd shrieked, torn in two. Some demanded the warrior be driven out. Others whispered that it was wrong, that it was unjust to attack the one person who had saved a life. The market chief was practically foaming at the mouth. "That kerchief is a disgrace!" he thundered, his arms flailing like a mad preacher. "If she keeps it, this whole town will be branded as weak." Tears streamed down the young woman's cheeks, but she raised the cloth higher. It was a silent, defiant gesture. She would not let it go, even as fear burned in her chest. The warrior met her eyes for just a second. Then he turned his gaze back to the crowd, and his deep voice boomed across the square. "If you want to tear that kerchief away," he said, his voice cold as stone, "you will have to go through me." The murmuring died instantly. His words had built a wall right in the middle of the square, but the market chief was beyond reason. He lifted a heavy wooden staff from a nearby cart. "I will not allow a savage to defy me in my own square," he roared and charged forward, the staff raised, ready to strike. The crowd held its breath. This was no longer just a fight over a piece of cloth. It was a public trial, and the town's honor was about to be weighed against the dignity of a simple kerchief, held in a pair of trembling hands. The chief's staff came crashing down, a blur of wood and fury aimed at the Dakota warrior's head. But it was stopped, not by the warrior, but by a voice, a cry that sliced through the square like a knife. "Stop! That kerchief is no common rag!" Every head turned. From the crowd, a bent old woman emerged. Her white hair was pinned beneath a dark veil. She shuffled forward on unsteady feet, her eyes fixed on the heart of the conflict. She raised a trembling hand and pointed at the kerchief clutched against the young woman's chest. "I embroidered that kerchief myself," she declared, her voice surprisingly strong. "Years ago, for the landowner's wife, and into its stitches I sewed the secret emblem of her lineage." The silence that followed was absolute. The young woman stared at the cloth in her hands, her mind reeling. The market chief's face went white, just for a second, before he put his mask of rage back on. The old woman pushed closer, brushing past the market men as if they were nothing but shadows. With her wrinkled fingers, she took a corner of the kerchief. She showed the crowd a small bit of embroidery hidden at the edge, a design of wheat entwined with a pair of initials, barely visible beneath the grime. "This kerchief," the old woman said, her voice clear and ringing, "belonged to the lawful wife of the landowner, and she passed it in secret to her daughter." She looked directly at the young woman. "She did not fall in the stampede by chance. Fate brought her here today, to claim what is hers." The crowd exploded. Some muttered that it was impossible. Others crossed themselves, as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Tears streamed down the young woman's face. In a single shocking instant, she understood. The kerchief, this thing they had called a stained rag, was the proof of her blood, the proof of her right. "Lies!" the market chief bellowed. "It's all lies! The old woman is senile! She's raving!" But it was too late. He couldn't erase what they had all seen, a hidden symbol that tied this forgotten girl to the most powerful family in the entire region. The Dakota warrior, tall and unwavering, took the kerchief from the young woman's hands. He raised it high for everyone to see. He wasn't holding a scrap of cloth anymore. He was holding a banner of truth. The murmur swelled into a roar of clashing voices. The square was split down the middle. On one side were those loyal to the chief. On the other, those who were beginning to believe. And in that moment of chaos, everyone knew. This was no longer about a rescue. It was no longer about a rag. It was about a hidden legacy that could change the fate of the entire town. The market chief, his face a mask of pure rage, tore the hat from his head and threw it to the ground. He stomped on it as if he could crush the truth that had just been revealed. "It's a fraud!" he screamed, and his men, emboldened by his fury, began to shove their way through the crowd. They wielded clubs and rusted chains. "The embroidery is fake! The girl is a beggar dressed up as an heir!" The old woman raised her voice, trying to defend her work, but one of the men shoved her back. She stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. The young woman rushed to catch her, pressing the kerchief to her chest. Her tears had stopped. In their place was a new, hard determination. The Dakota warrior stepped forward, his body a living wall between the attackers and the two women. His dark gaze made more than one of the men hesitate, but the chief's fury left no room for doubt. "Tear it from her hands before it bewitches you all!" he bellowed. Two men lunged for the kerchief. The warrior stopped them with a blur of motion. He seized the first man by the collar and hurled him into the dust. He ripped the club from the second man's hand and snapped it in two over his knee as if it were a dry twig. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others roaring in outrage. The square had become a cauldron of chaos. The sheriff still hadn't arrived. Then a new voice cut through the noise. "The embroidery is real!" Forcing his way through the throng was a young man, dressed in finer clothes than the rest. It was the landowner's son, the heir, late to the scene. "I've seen that symbol before, in my mother's things!" But his words were lost in the storm of shouts. Some of the men in the crowd were starting to pick up stones. The air was thick with the smell of violence. The young woman held the kerchief high. She was trembling, but she was resolute. That piece of cloth was her only shield, and with that simple gesture the crowd split more starkly than ever before. One side for the chief, the other for her, and for the warrior who defended her. The tension finally snapped. The market chief, driven mad by his crumbling authority, drew a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. "This farce," he roared, "will end in blood." The knife flashed in the sun. The crowd fell back, leaving an open circle in the dust. This was where it would be decided. Some shouted for them to stop, not to stain the ground with blood, but no one dared to move. The air was so heavy it felt like it was burning their lungs. The young woman, still clutching the kerchief, stumbled backward. Her face was a pale mask of terror. The Dakota warrior advanced. He moved without hurry, but each step was like the beat of a war drum. His eyes were locked on the man with the knife. The market chief spat on the ground. "No savage will ever decide the fate of this town," he snarled, and he lunged. The blade slashed downward, aimed to rip the warrior's chest open. But the Dakota moved with the grace of a predator. He spun, and the steel blade cut nothing but air. The warrior seized the chief's wrist, forcing the man's arm up toward the sky. But the chief fought back with the strength of pure hatred, his teeth bared like a cornered animal. The young woman cried out for them to stop, her tears soaking the kerchief she still held high. But no one heard her. The entire square was holding its breath. The landowner's heir tried to push through the crowd again, shouting that the kerchief was all the proof they needed. But the chief's loyal men blocked his path. With a savage wrench, the chief tore his arm free and struck again. This time, the knife found its mark. It grazed the Dakota's arm, leaving a thin line of crimson on his skin. The crowd gasped as one. Blood had been spilled. There was no going back now. The warrior's face hardened, but he remained calm. He planted his feet in the earth, ready. The market chief, panting and sweating, raised the knife one more time. The silence was absolute. Everyone understood. The next blow would decide not only the fate of the kerchief, but the fate of the entire town. The knife came down in a deadly arc, aimed straight for the warrior's heart. But in that exact instant, the young woman did something no one expected. She stepped between them. She lifted the white kerchief with both hands, as if that fragile piece of cloth could stop a blade. The steel grazed the edge of the fabric. It halted just a breath from her face. The Dakota had seized the chief's wrist with brutal strength, freezing the blow in midair. The crowd stood paralyzed. They weren't just watching a fight anymore. They were watching a symbol, a scrap of cloth suspended between life and death. The market chief thrashed like a wild animal. "She has no right to that name," he snarled. "That kerchief should be burned! Burn the lie!" The Dakota shoved. He wrenched the chief's arm downward, and with a sharp, violent twist, he forced the knife from the man's hand. The market chief stumbled to his knees in the dust, panting, defeated, humiliated. The crowd roared, a wave of clashing cries, but something had shifted. It was no longer possible to pretend this was just a simple squabble. The landowner's heir, his face pale but determined, finally broke through the crowd. He came to the young woman's side, his hand covering hers as she clutched the kerchief. Blood from the warrior's arm had dripped onto his shoulder. He raised his voice, clear and steady. "This is no rag. It is the inheritance of my blood, the memory of my mother, and the right of my sister." The silence that fell was so deep, it felt like the wind itself had stopped. The old embroiderer wept, her hands clasped in prayer. The children stared at the kerchief as if it were a sacred banner. The market chief, still on his knees, spat a mixture of blood and dust onto the ground. "Even if I lose today," he swore, "this town will never accept a bastard and a savage as its masters." The Dakota warrior simply looked at him, his silence holding more authority than all the chief's shouts. The crowd, slowly but surely, began to lean to the side of the kerchief. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone knew the next move would decide it all. The market chief staggered to his feet. His eyes were red, burning with a defeat he refused to accept. A new murmur rippled through the square as he reached inside his embroidered vest. He pulled out a scrap of tinder and a flint. "If this kerchief is an inheritance," he roared, his hands trembling as he struck the flint, "then let it burn before all!" A small flame leaped to life in his palm. The crowd screamed, stumbling back in horror. They finally understood. He no longer wanted to defeat the warrior. He wanted to destroy the proof. He wanted to burn the young woman's name, her bloodline, her entire identity, to ash. "No!" the young woman cried, clutching the kerchief. Her brother fought to push his way through the crush of bodies, shouting that it was sacrilege. The Dakota warrior stepped forward, but the chief brandished the flame like a weapon. "Anyone comes closer," he bellowed, "and I'll set it alight!" The air was thick with dread. The kerchief fluttering in the breeze seemed moments away from being destroyed forever. The old embroiderer fell to her knees, praying. Some of the men in the crowd began to whisper that maybe it was for the best. Let it burn. Let the conflict end in fire. But then, a child in the crowd did something incredible. He was too young to understand lineage, but he was not too young to understand injustice. He snatched a stone from the ground and hurled it. The stone flew through the air and struck the flint in the chief's hand, knocking it to the ground and snuffing out the spark. The chief screamed in pure fury. The crowd erupted with cries. In that single moment of chaos, the Dakota warrior moved. He lunged forward, wrenching the tinder from the chief's hand. He threw it to the ground and ground the flint into the dust with his heel until it was nothing but powder. The chief struggled, spitting curses, but no one came to his aid. His own men shrank back, their faces pale. They wanted no part in his ruin. The kerchief, still clutched in the young woman's trembling hands, waved clean and bright in the noon sun. It had survived a knife. It had survived mockery. And now, it had survived fire. But the chief was not finished. Kneeling in the dirt, he lifted his bloodshot eyes. "If I can't burn the cloth," he swore, his voice a low, terrifying growl, "I will make the girl pay with her life." With a final, desperate roar of hatred, the market chief hurled himself at the young woman, his hands curled into claws. He never reached her. The Dakota warrior caught his arm in midair. The force of the grip was so powerful that the snap of bone and the chief's scream of pain echoed through the entire square. The crowd surged forward, but this time they were not divided. They moved as one, not to help the chief, but to surround him, to cast him out like a plague. The sheriff, who had finally arrived, raised his voice. "That man will stand trial," he declared, "for attempted murder and for betraying the will of the landowner." No one objected. The authority of the town had shifted. Power no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to the truth. The chief was dragged away, his curses and threats drowned out by the scorn of the people he once ruled. In the silence that followed, the young woman, still trembling, lifted the kerchief. The cloth, stained with dust and tears, rippled in the breeze. It was a symbol of a dignity that no fire or blade could destroy. Her brother stepped forward and placed his hand over hers. "I recognize my sister," he said, his voice firm. "Let this be the seal that binds our family, long divided." The old embroiderer wept with pride. The children raised their small hands, as if they too wanted to touch the cloth that had become a banner. The Dakota warrior, seeking no glory, took the kerchief. He gently unfolded it and laid it across the young woman's shoulders. It was a coronation. The square was solemn. No one dared to mock. They all understood. What had begun as a tragic accident in a stampede had ended as a sacred act of redemption. Beneath the bright sun, the young woman smiled through her tears. She pressed the kerchief to her heart, and everyone knew what had once been fragile had become unbreakable. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.